So let's finish the series. It was supposed to be originally like 2 parts or 3 parts, and then it stretched into 5, as is often the case. But I think it's not a coincidence that it took this long and that we're finishing it dafka today. If you know a little bit about astronomical events, or if you follow the astronomical phenomena, it's also a special night today, 15th of January. Anybody know what's happening in the skies tonight? Yeah, which one? So tonight, Mars goes into opposition with Earth. It's like aligned with Earth. So it's actually very nice and bright in the sky. It's red, right? The red planet. You see a bright red star. You could see it very clearly. Yeah, with your naked eye, yeah. So Mars is in opposition. And why is that significant when we're talking about Adom? Because Mars is the red planet. Right, Adom is all about red. Adom means red. It's the red stew of Esav. Esav was called the red one. He was born red. He sold his birthright for the red stew. That's how our series started, discussing that episode. So everything red is associated with Adom. And Mars is associated with Adom. Mars is the red planet. Mars is the planet of Adom. And as we discussed before, in Roman mythology, Mars is the father of Remus and Romulus, the founders of Rome. They were orphans, right? They have this mysterious genealogy. They were left in the wild, and they were raised by a wolf, according to the myth, Remus and Romulus. And according to the myth, their father was Mars. Right? They were demigods, half man, half god. And then we also mentioned last time, another version of the myth was that the father of Remus and Romulus was Vulcan. And we said last time that Vulcan is connected to the person in the Torah called Tuval Cain. And the Torah says that Tuval Cain was the first blacksmith. He was the father of all blacksmiths. And in Roman mythology, the god of blacksmithing, the god of metallurgy and metalworking, is called Vulcan. And that's where the word volcano comes from, because his home was Mount Etna, the volcano in Sicily, Mount Etna, the word volcano from Vulcan, from the Torah's Tuval Cain. Tuval Cain is Vulcan. So there's another version of the myth that it wasn't Mars that was the father of Remus and Romulus, but that Vulcan was the father of Remus and Romulus. The consensus is, the majority opinion is that it was Mars, and Mars is the red planet. The month of March is named after Mars. Also Tuesday originally. In French is mardi, right? Named after Mars. So the days of the week are also named after the planets, right? Sunday is named after the sun, and Monday after the moon, and Tuesday is named after Mars. And Wednesday. We use the Germanic names, the Norse names, so Tuesday is Tug, but that's Mars. And Wednesday is named after Odin, that's why there's a silent D in Wednesday. But in French, it's easier in French. Mercredi, right? It's Mercury. And Thursday we have it named after Thor. But Thor, the Norse god, but in the Roman mythology, and so in French, Thursday is Jeudi, which is Jupiter. And Friday is named after Frigg, which is the Norse goddess Frigg. And in French, Vendredi is Venus. And then Saturday is Saturn, named after Saturn. And it's Shabbat. In Hebrew, Shabbat is Saturn is Shabtai. The planet is called Shabtai. So that's all. The 7 days of the week are named after the sun and moon and the 5 planets. So the 7 luminaries in the sky. So Tuesday is named after Mars, the red planet, the month of March. So it's all connected. And so tonight, Mars is in opposition. So it's interesting that tonight we're concluding our series on Adom. So I think it was meant to be. It's not a coincidence that it stretched for so long. And so last time we paused discussing Gog and Magog, right? Ezekiel's famous prophecy, Ezekiel chapter 38, where he says there's going to be this villain or somebody at the end of days who's going to oppose Israel, and he is called Gog, and he is from Magog, and he is Nasi Rosh Meshech Vetuval, and he is the leader of a place called Meshech Vetuval, or Rosh Meshech Vetuval, and we suggested last time, some people say Rosh is Russia, and Meshech perhaps is Moscow, or something like that, and Tuval, we talked about what Tuval is and where it originally comes from. We said that in Divrei Yamim, in the book of Chronicles, Meshech is mentioned as not just a descendant of Yefet. In Bereshit, Meshech is just a descendant of Yefet. a European people. But in Divrei Yamim, Meshech is also listed as a descendant of Shem somehow, of an Asian people. We typically associate Yefet, right? Noach had 3 sons, right? Shem, Ham, Yefet. And we typically say that the Asians, generally speaking, the Asian world, including Israel, is Shem, and the African world is Ham, and the European world is Yefet. It's not quite exact, more or less, because the Canaanites come from Ham, right? So it's not quite, but although the Midrashim say that the Canaanites conquered this land, that the Holy Land wasn't originally theirs, and they conquered it. The book of Jubilee says this, that they came from Africa and conquered the land. And so although we generally say that Shem is Asia, Yefet is Europe, but Divrei Yamim says that Meshech is not just a European people, but also somehow an Asian people. So last time we connected that to perhaps an allusion to the alliance between Russia and China. But a few people pointed out something which is actually really important to mention, that I should have mentioned last time, which is that Russia itself is actually the frontier between Europe and Asia. Russia is that piece of land, the area that connects Europe and Asia. And if you know a little bit about Russian history, you know that Russian history is all about the relationship with the Mongols, right? With the Golden Horde, the Tatars, and the Tatars, this Mongolian peoples from the east that would invade and plunder the West. And Russian history, especially early Russian history, is all about the interactions of the Slavic peoples trying to fight off the Mongol invaders, the Tatars. And Russian people in general have, the genetics is intermixed with Tatarian Mongolian people. So one can argue that Russia is very much like Meshech, both Yefet and Shem, both Europe and Asia, not just geographically, Russia being the frontier between Europe and Asia, the transition land between Europe and Asia, but even biologically and genealogically, that Russian people are a mixture of Slavic and Mongoloid. I mentioned in the past that the first official side of Tsar of Russia, the word Tsar literally is Russian for Caesar. It's even spelled that way. The way you spell it typically in English is C-Z-A-R. C-Z-A-R is literally Caesar, because the word Tsar in Russian is Caesar. So just to connect again to the Third Rome idea, that the Russian leaders for at least the past 500 years, or for much of the past 500 years, did see themselves as Caesars, as a continuation of Rome. And the first person who was Tsar of Russia was Ivan the Terrible, the infamous Ivan the Terrible, Ivan the Fourth, and he claimed to be descended both from, or he was descended both from a Byzantine princess on the one hand, the Byzantines being Constantinople, the second Rome, and on the other hand, he was also descended from a very famous Tatar warrior and general called Mamai. So even the first Caesar, the first Tsar, Caesar of Russia, claimed descent both from the Byzantines, putting himself in a direct line to the ancient Roman Empire, but also from the Mongolians, from Mongolian nobility, from the Tatars. So I think it's important to mention that as well, that further emphasizes the connection of Meshech to Moscow, to Russia, as being a blend of European and Asian peoples. And the only thing that we have left to talk about, that we said we would do tonight, is to talk about Gog. Who is this mysterious figure called Gog? Is there anybody else called Gog in Tanakh? Where in Bereshit? So Magog, perhaps, but an individual named Gog. Do you see an individual named Gog? There is actually one other person named Gog in Tanakh. So we often miss that. Again, to emphasize, I've said this so many times, how important it is to learn Tanakh all the time. It's something that we tend to neglect. We focus on other things. We're learning Gemaras, we're learning Zohars, we're learning Midrash, Halacha, Musar. But we should never forget that Tanakh has to be on your lips constantly, right? Vehegita bo yamam velayla. You should always have scripture on your tongue, the word of God. But again, in Divrei Yamim, in the end of Tanakh, there's somebody named Gog. And interestingly, it's not who you think. It's not some villain. It's not a bad person, at least we don't know, but it says, who is this Gog? It's in a genealogy of the descendants of Reuven. Of Ruben, the son of Yaakov, one of the 12 tribes. In the genealogy of the 12 tribes, Divrei Yamim gives you a genealogy of the 12 tribes. And the tribe of Reuven, the firstborn of Yaakov, it says, Bnei Reuven, Bechor Israel, the elder, the firstborn of Israel was Reuven, and his sons were Chanoch, Ufaluch, Hetzron, Vecharmi. And then it continues the genealogical list, Bnei Yoel, Shma'aya, and Bno Gog. So Gog was actually a close descendant of Reuven. There's only 2 Gogs mentioned in Tanakh. One is in Yechezkel, this villain who goes against Israel at the end of days and seeks to kind of plunder Israel, take advantage of Israel, steal Israel's wealth. And then this person who's a descendant of Reuven, which is really strange, no? What's the connection? Why would the Tanakh do this?
Where is it?
In Divrei Yamim, at the end of Tanakh, the book of Chronicles. Why would the Tanakh do that? Everything's a puzzle, right? Why would you have these 2 people both named Gog? What's the connection between Reuven, an actual Israelite, the son of Yaakov, and then this figure called Gog in Ezekiel, who's this bad guy, this foreigner coming to take over the land?
Maybe because it says Gog Magog.
The pshat is that it says his name's Gog from the land of Magog, that he comes from that land.
Do we know where the land is?
Magog, yeah, so it's Scythia. Scythia is precisely where Russia is. So Magog was identified as this land called Scythia, which is related to the Mongols and the Tatars who inhabited this region as well. And even as far back as Josephus says that Magog is Scythia, which is roughly where Crimea is today, southern Russia, the Caucasus region. So if you think about what's the connection with Reuven here, and Gog, and Edom, if you put it all together, it's actually going to make a lot of sense. Because what happened with Reuven? Reuven is the firstborn of Yaakov. But did he actually get to be the firstborn of Yaakov? No. He lost his birthright. In fact, this chapter of Divrei Yamim, chapter 5, that's how it begins. It says, Ubnei Reuven bechor Israel, ki hu bechor, he is the firstborn, uvechalalo yetzuei aviv, nitna bechorato livnei Yosef. That he lost his birthright to Yosef because of the various things he did that we're not going to get into now. But Reuven lost his birthright. Does that sound familiar? Who else lost his birthright? Edom. So right away you get an obvious connection. Divrei Yamim is actually introducing it like that, telling you, you're wondering, what is the Gog over there, presumably in Ezekiel, presumably associated with the last oppressor of Israel, of Edom. There's this Edomite Gog over here in Ezekiel. And then Divrei Yamim comes and says there's also a Reubenite Gog. And he also lost his birthright, right? Edom lost his birthright and Reuven lost his birthright. There's a very clear parallel over there. Edom is always seeking to reclaim that birthright, to take it back from Yaakov. What about Reuven? He also got pushed away in favor of somebody else, like Esav, like Edom. Right, the birthright went to Yosef, and Yosef got the double portion that the firstborn would get. Right, Yosef was split into 2 tribes, Ephraim and Menashe, like we read in last week's parsha. So Yosef got the birthright instead of Reuven. Reuven loses something, and ultimately Reuven gets dispersed. In terms of historically, the northern kingdom of Israel gets dispersed and is lost. Now, this connection between Reuven and Edom is actually even more profound, and the Torah makes it even more obvious. And when I read this to you, you're going to realize it, and you're going to say, how did I miss this before? It's so obvious. The Reuben-Edom connection. You remember the Choshen Mishpat, the breastplate of the high priest? And what was on the breastplate? Had 12 stones, right? There's 12 different precious stones, one for each tribe of Israel, in order of the tribes. And every tribe has a stone. What was the stone for the tribe of Reuven? Torah says the first row of stones, Odem, Pita, Uvareket, corresponding to the first Reuben, Shimon, and Levi. Odem, Pita, Uvareket. What is the stone of Reuben? Odem, Edom. It's the red one, right? Reuben gets the red stone.
And it's interesting that in English it's called a ruby.
And it's called a ruby, yeah, because of Reuben.
Good one. I like that.
The ruby was the stone of Reuven. That's where the name comes from. And it happened to be Odem in Hebrew. The same as Adom. It's the same Aleph, Dalet, Mem, same root letters, right? So the Torah actually is making this connection right, even all the way back then. Just like Edom, Esav lost his birthright, so did Reuven, and his stone is the red stone, is the Edom stone. And that's his color too. The stones gave colors to the tribes as well, right? Every tribe had a certain symbol associated with it, a certain color, a certain stone, and an astrological sign. So there's your Reuben-Edom connection. It sounds very much like there's this Gog. The Gog in Yechezkel, maybe, has some connection to the Gog in Divrei Yamim, who's from the tribe of Ruben. Ruben has the same claim that Esav has, which is, hey, I lost my birthright. That's not fair. I tried to be the good guy. I tried to do the right thing. They wanted to sell Yosef. I tried to save him. Right? I tried to save Shimon from prison later on and protect Binyamin. And Reuben seems to always kind of be trying to be the right person and to do the right thing, but always fails. And then he loses his birthright. It's kind of the same story as Esav Edom. And that's Reuben. So there's this Gog connection between the two Gogs in Tanakh. So what if this mysterious person called Gog in Ezekiel, because we don't know who he is. Yechezkel doesn't tell us his ancestry. What if that Gog is a descendant of one of the lost tribes of Israel, of the tribe of Reuven, and that's his inner, deeper spiritual motivation? Why is Gog so obsessed with stopping Israel or going against Israel at the end of days? What is the deeper motivation there? Maybe he's trying to reclaim his birthright. And that's where the Adom, Reuven, lost tribes connection comes in here. And the interesting thing is, in the Edomite world, in the Western world, many Western Christian European groups claim to be descendants of lost tribes. You can look this up. There's lots of fascinating things you'll read about this. Scandinavians who thought that they're the descendants of the lost tribes. Saxons even. The Anglo-Saxons, the Saxon tribes, some of them would claim that Saxon is Isaac's son, that the word Saxon comes from Isaac's sons. The British would claim that they're Brit Ish, that they're people of the covenant, that they're the direct descendant. And even to this day, the British royal family claims descent from the Davidic dynasty. There's a whole thing with the Dan, the tribe of Dan. You'll find this, you'll see a lot of this on the internet, of Europeans claiming to be descendants of the tribe of Dan, which is why you see across Europe, that's what they claim. That's why you see Dan all over Europe. There's Dan stuff, the Danube River, or Denmark, which is Denmark, right? Land of the Danes, or London, or whatever, the Dnieper River and the Dniester River, and so there's so many Dan, and Sweden, and they'll point out that there's the word Dan is found all across Europe, in rivers and cities, in whatever countries. I'm not saying that I believe this, I'm saying that's what they claim. There's many Europeans claiming to be descendants of lost tribes. So perhaps the inner, deeper spiritual motivation of Gog, the Gog in Ezekiel, is a belief of being a descendant of the lost tribes and trying to reclaim what is theirs. Maybe. Because Yechezkel seems to say that Gog's only motivation is money. That he's coming, laset kesef vezahav, for silver and gold. Lakachat mikne ukinyan lishlol shalal gadol. That Gog's entire motivation is financial. He just wants wealth and power, presumably. But is there something deeper beyond? Is there some connection to a lost tribe, a descent from an ancient Reubenite ancestor? I think that's what Divrei Yamim might be hinting to us by telling us that there's a Gog from the tribe of Reuben too. Who knows? Maybe it's the same Gog, or they're somehow related. The Tanakh doesn't just name two people the same thing, stam. There's usually some connection there. Now, if we're thinking about the world today, if Gog, we associate Gog, Ezekiel's Gog, with the third Rome, or with Edom, which is the final oppressor of Israel. And if we're making the case that that oppressor is perhaps Russia, and has been in the past, the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union. So who would be the Gog of today? Who would fit the profile, or who might be the Gog for today? Right. It's probably going to be Vladimir Putin, right? Because he's the leader of Russia, and he does have very imperial, that's what people claim. You'll see it in the media all the time, that Putin's described as somebody who's trying to revive the old Russian Empire, to reclaim the glory of the former Soviet Union and the Russian Empire before it, to recreate a new empire. He's been invading all these neighbors, Georgia, Crimea, now Ukraine. What is he really trying to accomplish, right? He's saying that it's to stand up to NATO. He's saying that it's for Russian sovereignty. Is that really the case, or is he really trying to rebuild what Russia lost? Because Russia was humiliated when the Soviet Union collapsed. Russia was humiliated and lost so much of its former territory. Is there a desire to reclaim all of that? I should mention here, a number of people also asked me, I said last time, I've said all along that the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989, and people always tell me you're wrong, it collapsed in 1991. Now, it's true that the Soviet Union dissolved officially on paper in 1991. But if you know the history of that time, and especially if you lived there, the Soviet Union was already crumbling in 1989. It was already over then. So I know personally, because my family was there, and in the beginning of 89 already, like where my family was in Uzbekistan, the place was falling apart. Militias on the streets, there was conflict, they were marching, claiming that they're going to exterminate the Jews. Jews were frightened because the Uzbekis were taking over. They were threatening to commit ethnic cleansing and get rid of all the Turks and get rid of all the Jews. This is at the beginning of 89. And my mom was pregnant with me then, and she thought I wouldn't make it. She was so scared. She tells me this. She was so scared. She didn't think that she'd get through the pregnancy. This is in the beginning of 89. Right? So that's what this, across the Soviet Union already, Soviet officials were fleeing, were losing power, local gangs were taking over, things were already changed. That's what led to the fall of the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall didn't collapse in November 89, stum out of nowhere. Right? There was things leading up to, what was leading up to that was that already, from the beginning of 89, even before that, the Soviet Union was already crumbling. And that's what allowed the Berlin Wall to fall in November 1989. And that was it. I mean, with that, the Iron Curtain was lifted. And finally, Jews could escape. And my family left right after that, a few months later at the beginning of 1990. That really was the end. So, yes, officially on paper, it took another couple of years to dissolve the Soviet Union. And it lasted until the end of 1991. But it was done in 1989. It was already finished and collapsed, and the Iron Curtain was lifted, and Jews could escape, and Jews were now free to leave at the end of 1989. That's why I always say 1989. I wanted to clarify that, even though I put it in the slides of the last class, that officially the Soviet Union lasted from 1922 till 1991, just shy of 70 years. Really, de facto, Lenin was already in the Kremlin by 1919 and was already running the country. So it really lasted from 1919 to 1989. Either way, it's 70 years. The point I was making is that the 70-year period mirrors the 70-year Babylonian exile and fits with what the Zohar says about Psalm 22, if you remember, Psalm 20, if you remember, about the Chevlei Mashiach being 70 years, based on the 70 words of that psalm, Psalm 20. 9 verses for like the 9 months of pregnancy, 70 words for the 70 years. So another important thing to clarify, because many people are emailing me, asking me, why did I say 89? That's why I said 89. And then that fits precisely with the prophecy of the Erev Shabbat prophecy of the cosmic clock of the 6 days of creation corresponding to 6,000 years of civilization, and the year 5750 being the final 6 hours before Shabbat, the beginning of Ikvot HaMashiach, which would correspond to 1989, 1990. So, back to Gog. If we have a certain person who might be Gog today, somebody who's very much concerned with his wealth and his power and expanding his empire, somebody could say that Trump fits that profile too. Trying to take Greenland and Canada.
He wants to be a king.
You're right. Yes. You can. There are a number of. There's not a lack of megalomaniacal world leaders right now. But who would be the oppressor, who would be the mafia guy, who would be the KGB guy, who would be the person who's more of a classic James Bond villain. Putin, I think, fits that bill very well. And he actually is, according to some estimates, the richest man on the planet. And in terms of the connection to what's going on in Israel, we said in the past that October 7 played right into Putin's plans because it got the world off his back with Ukraine. The attention shifted all to Gaza. Everybody forgot about Ukraine. Zelensky was crying, hey guys, you forgot about me. All the attention before October 7 was all about Ukraine, helping Ukraine. And since then, it shifted to Gaza, and now Ukraine lost a lot of money from that. So Putin won, because all the...
Ukraine got $100 billion.
Yeah, but before October 7, everything was about Ukraine. All the flags waving outside was Ukrainian flag. All the world's focus was on Ukraine. And post-October 7, the focus shifted in the media, on university campuses, all over. It shifted to Gaza. And a lot of people's money, I don't know, you see this like on YouTube, the ads come up, support Gaza. People are sending their donations. What they were sending to Ukraine 2 years ago, now people are sending to Gaza. So Ukraine's lost big time from October 7, and Russia won from that. And number two, October 7, if you remember leading up to October 7, Israel was about to make a peace treaty with Saudi Arabia. That was the all talk in August, September of 2023. All the talk was about the impending peace deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Included in that peace deal was oil and gas pipelines to Europe, which would undermine Russian oil and gas to Europe. Russia couldn't have that. They did not want that to happen. And so October 7 completely ended the conversation on that peace deal. And Russia saved itself a lot of money because their main business is selling oil and gas to Europe. That was number two. And number three, on top of all that, October 7 was literally Vladimir Putin's birthday. Right? So this was like a birthday present. Look it up. It was his birthday, October 7. So this was really a gift from Hamas and Hezbollah. And remember, unlike pretty much almost all Western countries who designate Hamas and Hezbollah terrorist organizations, Russia does not. In Russia, Hamas and Hezbollah are recognized political entities. And Putin hosts them very often. And right after October 7, he hosted a Hamas delegation and has several times since. And he's hosting Iran this week. They're signing a new cooperation agreement with Iran. They're helping each other. So, Russia's place in all this is pretty clear. The IDF was saying that most of the weapons they discovered in the in the Hezbollah caches in southern Lebanon were Russian-made. And they were surprised by how much Russian-made weaponry they had. And so it's pretty clear which side Russia is on here, although Putin has always styled himself in the past as more of a philo-Semite, as somebody who's a friend of the Jews and a friend of Israel. Until recently. Recently, the media always describes him as an anti-Semite. He said some things that might be perceived as anti-Semitic in recent weeks.
We always armed Israel's enemies.
That's true. In the past, though, you would have seen Putin always portrayed as someone who's a friend of the Jews. Right. And there's a lot of these feel-good stories. I'm sure you heard the story of his school teacher in Tel Aviv, right? He had a beloved Jewish teacher in Russia that then moved to Israel. And on a trip to Israel, this is a while back, he met her, and then he saw that she was living very meagerly in Tel Aviv, so he bought her a nice apartment in Tel Aviv. You see him often with pictures with Chabad's chief rabbi, Ber Elazar, and he meets with rabbis regularly for a nice photo op and so on. And remember, he has a lot of Jewish friends too. A lot of the oligarchs are Jewish. Roman Abramovich and all these guys.
He put a lot of them in jail too, right?
Yeah, some of them he put in jail. Depends who didn't want to be friends with him. The Jews that didn't want to be friends with him, like Khodorkovsky and all those guys, he made sure to put them in their place. And the ones that supported him, he let them do their thing. And so the image he's put out a pro-Jewish, philo-Semitic image in the past. So his relationship with Jews and Israel is quite complex. It's not so simple to just say, oh, he's an anti-Semite or something. And even his own ancestry, you will see people argue that Putin is secretly Jewish. Of course, they make that claim about everybody. Anybody that people don't like must be secretly Jewish, right?
Yeah, like
So,
was,
yeah, the conspiracy theorists love that. But it is compelling, and I'll tell you why, because his mom's last name actually is Shalomov, which is really strange. That's my wife's last name. So, my wife is Shalomov, her maiden last name, and Putin's mom is Shalomov. So it's spelled a little bit differently, but it's the same. And so some people say that's a very Jewy sounding last name, that maybe his mom was Jewish, and officially she's not, but some people have made that case. There was actually, back in 1999, a Georgian woman claimed that she was his real mother, and it created a whole scandal. And the two journalists that were investigating this were no longer investigating it because they were surprisingly dead very quickly. I don't want to laugh about it, but one died in a plane crash and one was beaten to death, both under very suspicious circumstances, and that was buried very quickly. So we don't know who Putin really is. He's this mysterious. He is Gog. I mean, from that perspective, he's like Ezekiel's Gog, who comes with no backstory, no genealogy. We don't know where he is. We don't know where he comes. Like, who is he? Although, again, to argue, I'm going to present both sides as much as possible. Others will argue. I remember this very vividly in 2008, when Barack Obama got elected. This was November 2008. I remember very clearly. A month later, I was at an event, December 2008, and a friend told me that Obama is Gog. Right. We've been hearing this for a very long time. And they even say that there's a Torah code for it. If you look in the first verse of that prophecy in Ezekiel about Gog, Nasi, Rosh, Meshech, Vetuval, if you look at the letter Nasi, the Aleph in the letter Nasi, if you count from that Aleph every 7 letters, it spells Obama. So that code was supposedly. I don't like Torah codes because you can find basically anything you want in Torah codes. But that was a code that was being passed around a lot 15 years ago about Obama being potentially a Gog, and the code that in the verse introducing Gog, Obama is apparently there every 7 letters. And again, it's true that his origins are also very mysterious. We don't know who Obama is. Was he born in America? Was he born in Hawaii? Was he born in Kenya? Is he an American? Is he not? And Trump, of course, was very famous for creating a big stink about Obama not being a genuine American and not eligible to be the president. You remember this back in the day? It was Trump that was... Exactly. It was Trump that was all about the birth certificate, going after the birth certificate of Barack Obama. So again, people will argue. You see, this mysterious Gog-like figure, who is he? Putin and Obama both have these mysterious origins, but Obama has not been in power for a long time. Arguably, I know you're going to tell me that Biden's presidency was just Obama in another form, but Putin's been in power all along. Right, so he's been the dictator continuously for 25 plus years. So all these people have mysterious origins, whether it's Gog or Putin or Obama or Remus and Romulus. We don't know who their real dads and moms are and where they come from. Putin's also tried to reclaim some land in Israel, in Jerusalem. There's a place called Alexander's Courtyard, which Russia claims is theirs, and they want it back. And one of the most salient features in Jerusalem, if you're driving in Jerusalem, you see on the Mount of Olives, you can't really miss it, you see a Russian Orthodox church, right? The Church of Mary Magdalene is right there. You know what I'm talking about? You've seen this before? Right on the Mount of Olives. There's a Russian Orthodox church right on the Mount of Olives. And in his vision of the end of days, Zechariah describes what's going to happen to the Mount of Olives. Yeah, he says first of all, God will come down, metaphorically, that it's as if God's feet will come down on the Mount of Olives, ve'amdu raglav beyom ha'u al har hazeitim asher al pnei Yerushalayim mikedem, to the east of Jerusalem, ve'nifka har hazeitim. It's metaphorical. Christians like to say that, you see, God will take human form and literally walk on the Mount of Olives. It's saying it's as if God's legs will come down and squash the Mount of Olives and it'll become a valley. As if God's legs will go on the Mount of Olives and turn it, ve'nifka har hazeitim mechetzio, and it'll be split in half, like it'll be smashed east-west, Mizracha v'yama, and it'll become a gei gdola. It'll become a big valley. So that's what should happen to the Mount of Olives. So I don't know what's going to happen to the Church of Mary Magdalene over there, but what's going to be on the Mount of Olives, Charia describes as being flattened and turning into a valley at the end of days. And right, if you remember, Charia says there's going to be darkness and there's going to be kipaon, this frostiness, a coldness, and he describes a certain plague that people are going to be as if melting, their eyes will melt in their sockets. Make of that description what you like. Some people see in that perhaps a nuclear, God forbid, a nuclear attack of some sort when you think about darkness and coldness, frost, kipaon, like a nuclear winter almost. It sounds really, really terrible. Hopefully it won't be something nuclear, but when you think about Russia, who's probably has the biggest supply of nuclear weapons, and who's helping Iran develop their nuclear weapons, and has been since 1990, and now again has renewed their commitment to Iran's nuclear program, and Iran's always threatening to want to flatten Israel. Hopefully it's not nuclear. Some people see in Zechariah's vision something nuclear. But ultimately, Zechariah says that living waters will flow from Jerusalem and heal everybody and heal everything and revive the land, and the whole world will recognize God. Bayom hahu yeh Hashem echad u'shmo echad, right? The whole world will recognize the one true God, and then there will be world peace and all of that. That's all in the same chapter. So the Mount of Olives also plays a prominent role in end of days prophecies, and there happens to be right now a Russian church right on it. Okay, so with all of that said, we can actually now, I think, understand the prophet Ovadya. All along I've been saying that we're going to talk eventually about Ovadya. Ovadya is in the Tanakh. It's one of what are called the minor prophets, although they weren't minor. They're just short. The Trei Asar, there are 12 books of prophecy that are so short that they're combined into one. And so one of them is Ovadya, and Ovadya is the shortest. Ovadya is the shortest book in the Tanakh. It's just one chapter. Just 21 verses. That's it. The Zohar actually explains why was it that Ovadya, the whole prophecy is about what will happen to Edom. The whole prophecy this is a prophecy concerning Esav, Edom. And the Zohar explains why was it Ovadya that merited to relay this prophecy. Why him? Who was he? We don't, again, another mysterious figure. There are several people in Tanakh named Ovadya. We're not quite certain which Ovadya this was. There was an Ovadya that lived at the time of Eliyahu, and he helped Eliyahu. If you remember the story, he took some prophets when King Achav and Queen Izebel were trying to destroy Torah and Judaism and bring instead paganism, and they were hunting down genuine prophets of Hashem. There was another person named Ovadya who saved 100 prophets in training in a cave and fed them and so on, and he helped Eliyahu. We don't know if this Ovadya is that Ovadya. Probably not. This Ovadya is probably a later Ovadya. There are several people called Ovadya. What we do know about this Ovadya is that he himself was a convert from Edom. And so the Zohar says, "V'chol inun nevi'in lo yachilu lekayama alma dizmin kutshabrichu lema'abed leile Esav." All the other prophets could not see what would happen to Esav at the end of days. Nobody was given that ability to foresee the future of Esav except Bar Ovadya Navia. Only Ovadya was given a glimpse of what should happen to Edom at the end of days. Why? Dehava Giora de Ate Misitra de Esav. Because he was a convert from Esav. He was himself an Edomite. And so because of that, he was tapped into that spiritual connection in the heavens that he was able to foresee what would happen to Edom. They mention, other prophecies mention Edom. We looked at Malachi before, he mentions Esav and Edom. Here and there, yes. Bilam mentions Edom and Amalek and so on. But this is an entire chapter devoted only to Edom, Esav. So other prophets only got glimpses. We spoke about Moshe last time, that Moshe told us about the kings of Edom. And that may have been a double-level prophecy about the kings of Edom at the end of days. We talked about that last time. But this is an explicit entire chapter about what should happen to Edom. And I think if you read this and you have in mind this connection to Russia and October 7, it actually starts to make a lot of sense. It's very short. We can go through this together. It starts by saying Chazon Ovadya. It's the vision of Ovadya. Ko amar Hashem God said le'Edom, Shamua shamanu me'et Hashem, we heard that an envoy was sent among the nations, and let us go to battle. And God ultimately tells Edom, Zdon libecha ishiacha, so your arrogant heart has seduced you. You think in your heart, who can pull me down to earth? Omer belibo mi yoridenu aretz. Nobody can drag me down. You in your lofty abode, you who live shochni bechagvei sela, think that nobody can bring you down. But I will, God says. Now, the pshat here is that this is referring to Petra. Remember we talked about Petra? The Edomite stronghold was what is today in Jordan, this big boulder, Petra, that has like structures carved into the mountains. That was an important Edomite stronghold. We talked about that before in parts 1 and 2. The pshat here is God is saying, you Edomites think that you're safe in Petra, in this stronghold, in this fortified boulder that you're in, but I will bring you down from there. Okay? That's the pshat for at that time. But if you see this as a vision of the end of days, which is what Ovadya is really saying, again, it's a double-level prophecy here, that Ovadya is also providing a vision for the end of days. And perhaps he's saying, hey, you Edomites of the 21st century, of the 20th century, who are in your lofty abode up there in the north, and you think that nobody can bring you down, because the truth is, throughout history, nobody has been able to bring down Russia. Yeah, many have tried. Napoleon tried and froze, and Hitler tried and froze, and many have tried to take Russia, and it doesn't work. Right? So they might feel a false sense of confidence that they're secure over there. Ech nichpesu Esav niv'u matzpunav ad gvul shilchucha kol anshe britecha. They translate it as how thoroughly rifled is Esav and ransacked are his hordes. So Esav goes to war and loses. He thinks he's very confident, and he goes to war very confidently, but then loses all of his hordes and is ransacked. And all of his allies as well with him, kol anshe britecha, who are at the frontier with him. So if you think about what Russia's been through in the last 2 years, this is very much it. They very confidently launched this special operation into Ukraine, thinking they'd get to Kiev in the span of several days, and it'll be over. They thought this war would be a quick thing, like a couple of weeks, a month, and it's now dragged on to this devastating thing that there's no end in sight. And nobody knows how many casualties Russia has suffered, but it's a massive, massive number. Right. You will hear massive numbers, hundreds of thousands. We don't know because they will not publish their data. But they've gotten desperate enough that, as we said last time, Russia's brought in mercenaries from North Korea. They have at least 10,000 North Koreans fighting on behalf of Russia, 12,000 fighting on behalf of Russia in Ukraine. That's how desperate they've become. But over here he's saying that even your allies that have come to support you on the frontier are abandoning you and leaving. V'chatu giborecha teiman. Chatu giborecha teiman. Leman ikaret ish mehar Esav mikatel. Your warriors shall lose heart, and it says teiman. Now, what does teiman mean? So, Teiman today is Yemen, but what does Teiman literally mean? It literally means south. Teimana is south. So, the word Teiman in the Torah is usually referring to Edom, because the land of Edom was south of Judea. South, right? If you look at a map of like a biblical map, there's Yehuda, and south of Yehuda, where the Negev desert is, and then across the Jordan on the other side, like where Petra is, that's like south and southeast of Judah is Edom. So Edom was also called Teiman. But fast forward to today, what is Teiman today? Teiman is Yemen, right? Yemen it's the same root even in Arabic, and in Hebrew is Yemen, because that's the southernmost tip of that region, of the Middle East basically, of the Near East, of the Arabian Peninsula. So if you think about what's happening now in Israel, it's pretty amazing. Israel was fighting Hamas first. They finished most of the work with Hamas, and then they proceeded. In the fall, they moved to Hezbollah. They focused on Hezbollah September, October, November, and then they made a ceasefire with Hezbollah. And then what happened? The next age, First it was Hamas, then Hezbollah, then the Houthis. Now in the last few weeks, we keep hearing of the Houthis sending these long-range missiles and hitting various targets in Israel, thankfully unsuccessfully. Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis. The Houthis from Yemen. You'd think, what does Yemen have to do with anything? They're all the way over there. Like, why are you getting involved here? They have their own problems. They have a famine, starvation, terrible, terrible things going on in Yemen, civil war. And somehow they have enough long-range missiles to shoot to Israel. But what's amazing about this verse is, listen carefully. Vechatu giborecha Teiman. It's literally Houthis, right? Chatu giborecha Teiman. The giborim of Teiman, the warriors of Teiman, who are they? The Houthis. Chatu giborecha Teiman. And the very next verse, this is unbelievable. This verse, Chatu, Chutim, what's the very next verse? Mechamas achicha Yaakov. The next verse is, Hamas literally means violence, but the word used for the violence is Hamas. Right? You have the Houthis and you have Hamas, one after the other, in two verses, one after the other. It's like we're reliving the last couple of years, reading these verses. Now, it's interesting. So a friend shared with me, again, I want to keep pointing this out, because I keep pointing out how you could also interpret this as referring to the United States, which a lot of people do. You can say it's Putin, you can say it's Trump, you can say it's Obama, you can always do it that way. And a friend shared with me a little while back a podcast from the Kiddush Club. I don't know if you've heard of the Kiddush Club podcast, but they had an episode with a guest, Jake Turks, and he interpreted Ovadya. I listened to it, and it was also very interesting. And I bring it up because he interprets this the exactly opposite way, with Esav Edom referring to the United States. So if you want to see it interpreted oppositely, you can listen to that Kiddush Club podcast about Edom. And these words are, of course, the same. You're going to interpret Hamas as Hamas, obviously. That's Houthis are Houthis and Hamas is Hamas. There's no way to interpret that differently. That's obvious to anybody reading it. And I've written about it in the past. I've written about Ovadya even years back, before October 7, and this is plain and obvious. But you can interpret Edom as Russia or as the United States. So you can listen to that and see which one makes more sense. So there's always like two sides to it. And we just always have to remember, a lot of people are asking, emailing, commenting, like, what if this is Edom? What if this is the Rome? What if this is that? The truth is the whole Western world is Edom, ultimately. So there's just different elements within Edom. And we have to remember that yes, the United States is a part of Edom, and so is Russia, and so is Europe. That whole half is Edom, and you have the Ishmaelite world, and you have the Edomite world. Because I know people are going to say, well, you can interpret it like this too, as referring to the United States. I personally believe it fits the description of Russia a lot better, especially in relation to what's happening in Ukraine, and Russia's hand in October 7, and Russia's hand in arming Hamas and Hezbollah, and welcoming them, yes, and hosting them, and working with them, and the Putin connection to October 7, and all these things. I think altogether just sounds, for me, it sounds a little more reasonable, especially in light of the fact that also, as we said last time, that America's generally always been a good friend of Israel, even when it hasn't been a friend of Israel sometimes.
At least the Jews. At least it's been a friend of the Jews.
Yes, Jews have always, exactly. Right. Jews have never been oppressed in America. Right. America's always been a safe haven for Jews. That's important to remember that and to emphasize that. But in these next verses, you can interpret this as referring to people in the US or in Europe across the world of Edom, because it says, when all these people came against Israel, against Jerusalem, and plundered Israel, you stood by with them, and you did not support your brother. Esav is supposed to be a brother of Yaakov, but he did not help him in his time of distress. And he stood by, and he stood silent, and he even supported the enemy who was coming to plunder Israel and to harm Jews, Judeans, and Esav did nothing about it. Esav stood quietly. Edom was quiet. Edom seemed to even gloat at Judah's day of ruin and did nothing. Again, to put it in context, in the Pshat, is that this was about the Babylonian destruction of Judea, that the Edomites did nothing to help the Judeans when the Babylonians came and crushed Judea and destroyed Jerusalem. The Edomites were like gloating and we were happy about it. And Ovadya is saying, you'll get yours too, right? And Edom will ultimately be extinguished and will cease to exist. which is what happened by the year 6 CE. We mentioned before, the Roman Empire dissolved Edom, the Idumeans ceased to exist and disappeared from history, the actual physical, biological Idumeans. So that's the pshat of why Ovadya is saying this. At that time, it was in reference to the Babylonian destruction of Judea. But you can apply that to today, because post-October 7th, the sympathy for Israel in the West lasted exactly 24 hours. And after about a day or two, everything shifted to the pro-Palestine, the pro-Hamas, and the pro-everything, anti-Israel. And yes, all the care was about the poor Gazans and the poor Palestinians, and the pressure was always on Israel, and the handcuffing Israel and not letting them defend their own people and their own country. So you can certainly see in this that this description of Ovadya, of Edom just not supporting their brother and gloating at their brother's downfall and standing silent while foreigners came and plundered Judea. If we see that specifically about Russia, we know that they also, again, were in collusion with Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran in all of this, and continue to host them and work together with them. So it just fits very well. And they're also harboring Assad now, right? Assad fled. Where did he flee? He fled to Russia, right? So just to further emphasize on which side Russia is on. The last few verses of Ovadya, the good stuff will come, and then finally Judea will come back. And ve'yarshu ha'negev et ha'reisav ve'ashfela. So finally the Judeans will take back, will repossess, will settle the Negev, Hareisav, which is the region of Edom, Vehashfela, the Shefela is the lowlands of Israel, which is not far from like this neighborhood where this is happening. Everything in Israel is close, like between Gaza and where Yehuda and Shomron is, that region, and the Plishtim, Vet Plishtim, and Philistia, which is what is today roughly Gaza. It will be repossessed. And they will also, Ve'yarshu Tzde Ephraim, Ve'etzde Shomron. Okay, this is Yehuda and Shomron that we're talking about, right? Ephraim and Shomron is that territory, what's called the West Bank. Ubinyamin, also there, Yehuda, Binyamin. Remember, Jerusalem is built half on the tribe of Binyamin and half on the tribe of Judah. And at Hagilad. Where's Gilad?
It's Syria.
Gilad is closer to Syria. Yeah, it's closer to where the Golan is, right? The tribe of Menashe. Gilad is the land of Menashe, a bit further north. So all of that will no longer be in dispute, whose territory that is. And then the Galut and the exile, Achel Hazel Livnei Israel, the Israelite exile, Asher Kna'anima Tzarfat, that goes as far as Tzarfat. What's Tzarfat?
I think that's in Jordan.
We think Tzarfat is France. I mean, we today interpret Tzarfat, right. Just like we say Taiman is Yemen, Tzarfat for us is France. Back then, Tzarfat was in Lebanon. Eliyahu went to Tzarfat, right? There's a story of Eliyahu who he at one point went to Tzarfat. He didn't go to France. He went north to Lebanon. The Galut Yerushalayim and the exile of Jerusalem, Asher Bisfarad. What's Sfarad?
Spain.
Again, to us, that's Spain. Back then, Sfarad is Saparda in what is, again, today roughly Turkey. In what is today Turkey, there's a place called Saparda, or it used to be a place called Saparda, that's Sfarad. For us, it means Spain. Irshu et Arei Negev. We'll come back to repossess our lands. Ve'alu Moshiim, and then the final verses, Ve'alu Moshiim beHar Tzion, and then saviors shall arise on Har Tzion, lishpot et Areisav, to judge the mountain of Esav, Ve'aita leHashem Amlucha, and finally we'll have a divine, proper, kingly kingdom, a godly kingdom at the end. And Ve'alu Moshiim, saviors shall arise. That's one of the places from which you get that there's more than one Mashiach, perhaps, a Mashiach ben Yosef and a Mashiach ben David, of two figures. So that's Alum Moshiim. So that's how the whole passage ends, with Israel finally reclaiming its proper ancestral territories and all the exiled Jews coming back from as far away as France and Spain. And you see that in Israel today as well. Lots of people from France coming to Israel. One of the major communities of Olim, of immigrants to Israel, is from France. Now, Rashi's commentary here is really interesting. Listen to what he says. Livnei Israel asher kna'anim tzarfat. That's the pasuk in Ovadya. Galut asher hu mibnei Yisrael shegalu me'aseret hashvatim. The exiled 10 tribes, aseret hashvatim, from the northern kingdom of Israel, the other tribes, where did they go? La'eretz Kna'anim at Tzarfat. They were exiled to the lands of the Kna'anim until Tzarfat, until France. Ve'galut Yerushalayim asher bisfarad. Who is this? Shehem mibnei Yehuda asher galu lisfarad. These are the Judeans. So that Rashi is saying that the exiled 10 tribes went to what is north, to the lands of the Kna'anim, which I'll explain in a second, all the way to France, to Tzarfat. And the Judeans, the Yehudim, and from the Yerushalayim, went to Lisfarad, to Spain. Rashi is basically telling you that it's as if that the Sephardic Jews are Judeans from Yerushalayim, and Ashkenazi Jews from Europe are from the lost tribes. That's what he seems to be saying. And he himself is a Tzarfati. Rashi lived in France. He was French. And he explains, he makes this explicit. He says, Ve'omrim, the commentators explain, Tzarfat hiya malchut shekorin Franza. In our language we call it Francia, it's France. And Sfarad, Tirgem Yonatan, even 2,000 years ago, Targum Yonatan says, what is Sfarad? Aspamia. It's Hispania, the Roman province of Hispania, of Spain. Amazing. Now, let's clarify what exactly is going on here. Rashi is saying, in the time, this is really important to understand. Today we think of the Jewish world as just being kind of like Ashkenazi Sephardi. But back then, the Jewish world was divided up into really 4 sections. There was Canaan, there was Tzarfat, and then there was Ashkenaz, and there was Sfarad. These were 4 different things. Okay? Now, Canaan, what does that mean, Canaan? When Rashi says that these are the exiles that are in the lands of the Knaanim ad Tzarfat, what do you mean the lands of the Canaanites? Where are the Knaanim? Canaan is Israel.
Right.
What is he saying here? What is that? How can you be an exile in Canaan? Isn't Canaan Israel? You see the problem? So we sometimes forget this because, again, we need to know our history, and we don't study enough history. If you look at historical texts from the time of Rashi, it wasn't Ashkenazi Sephardi. There was 4 communities in Europe. Knaani, Ashkenazi, Tzarfati, Sfaradi. The Knaani community was the Eastern Europeans. 1,000 years ago, roughly, Eastern European Jews were called Knaani Jews. Why were they called Knaani Jews? It's an amazing thing. Before Africa became the main source of slaves for Europe, that was recent. Africa became a major source of slaves only in the last 300-400 years. Before that, 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, in Roman times, what was the main region that was the source of slaves for Europe? It was Eastern Europe. Eastern European tribes were the ones that would be enslaved. They were very weak. There were no big kingdoms or empires there. Eastern Europeans were enslaved. The Slavs were the major source of slaves. And note what I'm saying. The Slavs were the major source of slaves. The English word slave comes from Slav. Because they were the slaves. 2,000 years ago, it wasn't black people that were associated with slavery. It was white people, ironically. So it was actually the very whitest Slavic peoples. Eastern Europeans were slaves. And to this day, the word slave is actually the same word as Slav. Okay. So, what does that have to do with Knaani Jews? Well, the Knaanim were slaves in the Holy Land, right? Noah cursed Canaan to be an Eved, to be a slave. Knaanim were cursed to be a slave people. So the Jews who lived in Eastern Europe, that region, Eastern Europe, in Hebrew, was called Canaan. The point is that the Canaan 1,000 years ago meant Eastern Europe, because that was where slaves came from. It was Slav, literally. Slav translated into Hebrew was Canaan. So Knaani Jews were Jews in Eastern Europe. Then you had Ashkenazi Jews. Ashkenaz is Germany. Ashkenaz is mentioned as one of the sons of as one of the descendants of Yefet by Noah. Ashkenaz was, by the way, scholars say that Ashkenaz is the same root as Saxony, as Scansia. Ashkenaz is Saxony, Scansia, which is Germany. That's where the name comes from. And then Tzarfat is France, and Sfarad is Spain. So that gives you the whole kind of Europe, right? From east to west. Eastern Europe, Germany, France, Spain. Those were the four communities. So it's a common misconception. People today say that Rashi was this great Ashkenazi sage. He was not Ashkenazi. Rashi did not describe himself as Ashkenazi.
He wasn't Ashkenazi Russian.
Rashi describes himself always as Tzarfati, as French. He says, I am the son of Rav Yitzchak the Tzarfati. And he says, when I traveled to study with the Ashkenazim in Worms, in Mainz, he refers to them as other. Like he says, I'm Tzarfati and I studied with Ashkenazim. So yeah, Rashi learned with the Ashkenazim, but he did not identify as Ashkenazi. He didn't speak Yiddish. When he, in his commentary, he never says Yiddish. He says, in my language, it's French. He uses a French word because he spoke French. Right? So it's a common misconception that people today will describe Rashi as Ashkenazi.
But maybe Yiddish didn't exist in that.
Not to the extent that it does now. It was a different Yiddish, but meaning Ashkenazi Jews then spoke some Germanic language. Right? Eastern Europeans spoke your Jews living in Eastern Europe spoke some Slavic language. Those two ultimately fused into Yiddish. Yiddish is a mixture of German and Russian, ultimately. And Tzarfat, France, it was a different thing, and they spoke French. Rashi speaks French. When he wants to translate a word to explain it, he says, in French it's this. He doesn't say in Yiddish it's this, or in German it's this. He says French. So you can see that back then, 1,100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, there was a clear distinction between Ashkenazi and Tzarfati, and Sfaradi and Knaani. But what happened over time, and that's why Rashi is saying that the Aseret HaShvatim, the 10 tribes, were exiled into the lands of the Knaanim at Tzarfat, meaning from Eastern Europe, Knaan, Germany, Ashkenaz, to Tzarfat. And then the Judeans, the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalemites, were exiled to Spain. And that now gives you the whole picture. Now, of course, yes. Now, of course, there's also the whole Mizrahi world. There are Jews in Morocco, there are Jews in Egypt, there's Ethiopian Jews, there's Jews in Uzbekistan, there's Bukharians, there's Syrians, Iraqis, Yemenites. For sure, you also have the whole Maghrebi Jews, like in North Africa, and the Mizrahi Jews in Asia and Arabia. No, there were always Jews there. There were always Jews there. Yeah, of course. So over time, what happened is that Knaani, Ashkenazi, and most of Tzarfati kind of fused together and they all kind of became Ashkenazi. And then the southern France and Spain and northern Africa and the Mizrahi kind of all joined together and became Sfaradi. So today we see it as Ashkenazi and Sephardi, but back then it was a lot more complicated. Right? Today it's kind of like everybody who's not Ashkenazi, like Eastern Europe, Eastern or Central European, is Sephardi. If you're even Ethiopian, Bukharian, Syrian, Yemenite, none of these are technically Sephardi, although there were Sephardic Jews that migrated to these places, sure, and intermarried with those Mizrahi communities and African communities. So it's important to clarify that. So going back to Gog, can Gog be a descendant of Reuven? Well, it makes sense, because Rashi is telling us that the lost tribes, including the tribe of Ruben, was exiled to the lands of Canaan, to Eastern Europe. So if Gog is connected to Russia, that fits very nicely. Right? So maybe there is a Gog connection, being a long-lost descendant of Reuven, and having a deeper spiritual motivation beyond just money to reclaim Israel, to reclaim his birthright, to take back what is his, just like Edom. Same thing. Ruben and Edom are trying to do the same thing here, reclaim their birthright. Say, I should be. Forget Ishmael for now. Well, we'll need another 5-part series on Ishmael. And so you have that Edom-Reuven connection again, and the ruby on the breastplate. It all comes together. And just as a quick side note, because we're running out of time, but because it comes up so often that people will say that Ashkenazi Jews are fake Jews because they are converts, they're all Khazarians, you've heard of this? So there's this conspiracy theory that it's true that in the 800s-ish, in the 8th or 9th century, there was this powerful kingdom called Khazaria, which was roughly where Scythia is, where Magog is. And Khazaria was a dominant kingdom back then in this region, Crimea, Caucasus. And we know that at some point, at least somebody in their royal family converted to Judaism. We even have coins. There are Khazarian coins that say they're modeled on Arabic coins, but instead of like Arabic coins saying there's no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet, they say there's no God but Hashem and Moses is his prophet. And we find these treasure troves of these coins across archaeological sites from Europe to China, because the Khazarians had a pretty vast trade network. And the official story goes that the Kazarian king wanted some new religion because his people were pagan and they didn't really have a religion. So he said, okay, let me invite the Christians, the Muslims, and the Jew, a rabbi, a priest, and an imam. This sounds like the start of a good joke. So I'll invite a rabbi, a priest, and an imam and let them present their case. And ultimately the rabbi presented the best case and the Khazarian king converted to Judaism. And his name was possibly Bulan, maybe Sabriel. There's different accounts. Again, very mysterious era of history. We don't know much about what happened there. We definitely know there was a Khazarian kingdom. We have their coins. We have archaeological evidence. But we don't know to what extent they converted to Judaism. Probably not the entire kingdom. It was probably just the royal family or maybe just one king. Some people say he wasn't a convert, that he was a Persian Jew. There were many Persian, Armenian, and Babylonian Jews from the Middle East that migrated to Khazaria, because Jews often go where there's opportunity and there's business, and they'll go to America and they'll go wherever there's. Khazaria was the America of the day 1100 years ago, and a lot of Jews went there, and it was a place away from Christians and Muslims where Jews could live peacefully. Christians were persecuting Jews, Muslims were persecuting Jews, so a lot of Jews were fleeing to Khazaria. So actually most of Khazaria's Jews weren't converts anyways. They were not ethnic Khazarians. They were Persians, Armenians, and other Jews that went there. And some people say it was one such Persian Jew, Sabriel, who ascended to the nobility. So we really don't know much. But the point is, you'll see this conspiracy theory, whatever you want to call it, arguing that Ashkenazi Jews are all descendants of Khazaria and they're not real Jews and whatever. It's nonsense. It's been disproven many times. There's no historical evidence to support it. Genetic evidence disproves it. The genetics of Ashkenazim has nothing to do with Khazarians, which are more of a Turkic people. Different mitochondrial DNA, different haplogroups. There's nothing to it.
Basically, the same as
Yeah, again, there's nothing to it. I specifically want to talk about it because I get emails. I got an email recently from somebody saying, like, I don't know, I'm Ashkenazi. Am I a real Jew? People are telling me I'm not really. Like, you are. Don't worry. It's okay. And in any case, even if the Khazarians converted, that makes them bona fide Jews. Once you're a convert, you're 100% Jewish. So doesn't even if they converted, it still wouldn't put their Judaism in question because a convert is perfectly Jewish. Point is, these were the Jewish communities back then. Ashkenazi Jews are fully Jewish, and there's no question about that. But you will hear these conspiracy theories. Over the course of these series, we've mentioned a lot of conspiracy theories, in case you haven't noticed. The music industry and Baphomet and the Rothschilds and Epstein, and a lot of that's come up. So throw this one in there too, the Kazarians. The anti-Semitism is rampant. And, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs had a really nice quote. I don't remember exactly how he said it. It's a lot more eloquent than what I'm going to say. But he said, and the real tragedy of anti-Semitism is not what it makes Gentiles think about Jews, but what it makes Jews think about Jews. Right? Because sometimes Jews who don't know their history and who don't know this, they get confused. They're like, well, who am I? Like, is the Talmud really satanic? I don't know. Like, the people start to question who they are. Oh, I'm Ashkenazi. Am I really Jewish? Maybe I'm a Kazarian imposter, right? So the real tragedy is what it makes sometimes Jews think about themselves. That's really sad. So to finish on a positive note, there's one more Edomite that we have to discuss. There's one last person who has an Edom connection that, for us being where we are now, in Acharit HaYamim, in Nikvot HaMashiach, who is Mashiach really? Where is Mashiach? Where does he come from? You remember the story of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi in Masechet Sanhedrin? Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi says, I want to meet Mashiach. And Eliyahu tells him, no problem, go find him, go talk to him. He says, what do you mean? Where is he? Where is he? You say, remember? Where does he go? He says he's in Rome. He's at the gates of Rome. Mashiach is waiting at the gates of Rome, and he's this leper, right? He has bandages, and he's changing his bandages one at a time. He's this mysterious leper, another mysterious figure, like Gog, right? And as if he's covered up in bandages, so nobody knows who he is. He's a leper, with a mangled identity. So he's apparently in Edom. Ve'alu Mosheim, that the saviors will arise and go to Har Esav, go to the mountain of Esav. And so this week's Parsha, Parashat Shmot, this week's Parsha is the birth of Moshe. And the Midrash says, Shmot Rabbah says, Just as v'chen bat paro megadelet mi she'atid le'para me'avia, just as the daughter of Pharaoh raised the boy that would ultimately bring down her father's dynasty, the Pharaoh, ve'af melech HaMashiach, so too with Mashiach, she'atid lipara me'edom, who's supposed to liberate Israel from the Edomite oppression, im yoshev imaem b'medina. Mashiach also is in Edom. So if you thought Mashiach's in Israel, apparently not. Mashiach's in Edom. He is with the Edomites at the beginning. Of course, eventually he goes to Israel. But he begins his journey in Edom. And it brings a verse to prove it. That's the Midrash Rabbah.
Is he going to be a convert or what?
No, he cannot be a convert because he has to be a direct descendant of King David. So can't be really be a convert. Mashiach ben David has to be descendant from David. So David's a Yehuda. Technically, Yehuda is not a lost tribe. He would be a Judean.
We went to Spain.
Right? At least from his paternal line, he would have to be a Judean. Now, that's the thing. On the mother's side, I wrote an essay about it. If you're interested, it's called Mashiach's Ancestry. I can link to it when I post the video about where exactly he's supposed to come from. There is a tradition that the father is from Yehuda, direct descendant of King David. The mother is from the tribe of Dan.
You're saying
That's
that
possible.
he has a Russian background?
No, I didn't say that. Well, depending on who you define as Edom. It just says Edom. Edom could be America, Edom could be Europe, Edom could be Russia. If you want to connect it to Third Rome, and Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi meeting him at Rome, and that's the same page of the Gemara talks about the three Romes. So if you want to connect that to Russia, yeah, it could be perhaps a Russian background. I think Lubavitchers would love that because the Lubavitcher Rebbe was born in the Russian Empire. You see, Lubavitcher Rebbe was there, so
Except that
he's
he's not
a
alive right now.
Right. It's funny. I had a conversation with a Lubavitcher today about something totally unrelated. It was a business meeting, but I said, "You're a Lubavitcher. You think the Rebbe's Mashiach? Of course." Right? And so I started picking his brain about it a little bit. And I said, "And if he still doesn't come in 100 years, you still going to believe he's Mashiach?" He said, "Of course. I said, "There's no expiry date." Never. Right? It's Mashiach forever.
Why not?
So.
Maybe I'll look at it.
Well, I want to talk about that separately, about this, about the Chabad Messianism. Maybe we'll do that in a few weeks. We'll do a separate class on
But
that.
did he himself proclaim to be the Mashiach?
Not explicitly, but he hinted to it that he might be.
But then you said he also, there was a time where he said that he...
Right. He did deny it. There were many times where he denied it, but there were also times, especially later in his life, when he didn't deny it. And so it's hard to... He gave a speech, I believe it was 1991, where it's like he seems to have given up. He said, "I've done everything I can. It's like I failed. The rest is up to you." Lubavitchers didn't know what to make with that speech. It's a very the Rebbe was like crying. He was like, "I've done everything I can to bring Mashiach, and still Mashiach hasn't come. How is it possible?" He was distraught. Yeah, he made it seem like he's not. He thought he might be, and he failed. And then not long after, it was around the time where he got the stroke, and then after that he couldn't even really speak, and then he died not long after. So that was basically the end. But
He did a lot to bring the world
no doubt.
into
No
the
doubt.
Mashiach, I think,
Absolutely.
but,
Absolutely.
It wasn't his final mission.
Absolutely. He definitely helped to bring about Mashiach consciousness.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely. But yeah, Mashiach has an Edomite connection. He's growing up in Edom, just like Moses grew up in Egypt. He's not in Israel. He's there. He's in the place where he's supposed, because he has to learn what he has to fight. He's up against, right? And so he's there within, and his ultimate job is to bring down the wicked prince of Edom. We remember this idea of every nation has a certain heavenly prince or a guardian angel. Yeah. And the guardian angel of Edom is Samael, right, who's like the wicked one, right? That's almost like maybe a fallen angel or the one who's associated with the Yetzer Hara. And it's Mashiach's job to neutralize that Samael force. And the Samael is associated with the Nachash in the Garden of Eden, and sometimes is described as almost riding a serpent, riding a Nachash. And if you remember, we've mentioned this many times, including in the last class, that Gimatria Nachash is Gimatria Mashiach, because both are 358, because one has to neutralize the other. And ultimately, Mashiach's role is to neutralize the prince, the heavenly prince of Edom, which is Samael. And so that's why there's a Mashiach Edom connection, that he has to be there to understand what Samael is, what Edom is, who Edom is, the language of Edom, right? The whole ideology of Edom. It has to be destroyed from within. You have to know what you're fighting, right? It can't be from the outside, right? A Haredi kid who was in yeshiva his whole life and was never exposed to Edom cannot defeat Edom. He has no clue what he's up against, right? You have to do it from the inside. Just like Moshe. Moshe could defeat Egypt because he was Egypt. He was a prince of Egypt. He was from Egypt. He grew up in the palace. He knew it from the inside out. That's the idea here. That adversary of, and I think this is really important now to get to this, that adversary of Mashiach is not called Samael, because Samael is like an angelic being. But the physical representation of that, at least the earthly representation of that, is another figure who's not Gog, who's Armilus. And if you remember, we did the series about Mashiach ben Yosef. It's always Armilus there, not Gog. Is Gog and Armilus, are they the same person? Doesn't look like it. Gog is described as this political entity who's trying to just like make money and who's invading militarily. It's like a physical, political figure. Armilus is something much greater. Armilus is some kind of spiritual entity. Armilus is described as being the offspring of Samael. And Armilus is always paralleled with Mashiach ben Yosef. And Gog is usually paralleled with Mashiach ben David. So it's almost like two distinct things over here. And we have to understand the difference between Gog and Armilus. Armilus is not a biblical term. Gog is in Tanakh. Armilus is not. And so Gog is very much a physical entity. And Armilus is more of like a wider spiritual thing associated with Samael, associated with the Sitra Acha, with the Seirim, with, remember the goat demons that we talked about in part 1? That Esav lives on Har Seir, on the mountain of the goat demon, right? That's the force of Samael. That's specifically the job of Mashiach ben Yosef to defeat. David is up against Gog as a political figure. David is a king. He's King David. He's a political figure. Yosef is more of something bigger, something spiritual, something cosmic. And he's up against the spiritual force, Armilus. And you see it even in their names. Gog and David. Look at the names. Gog is Gimel Vav Gimel. David is Daled Vav Daled. It's like the same with one letter up, right? You take the next letter after Gimel is Daled. It's like David is one more than Gog. It's one above in every way. Gog, the root of it, seems to be Gag, which literally means a roof. David is Daled, which is a door. So one's a roof, one's a door. Right? David's job is to open doors, open the door of Geulah, and Gog's job is to put a roof on, to quash it, to cover it up, to close it up. And you see it in the parallel within their names. And then you have Mashiach ben Yosef, whose whole thing is to neutralize Armilus, right? That's a more spiritual struggle. And we talked about this in the Mashiach ben Yosef series, that there's a book that goes back to the teachings of the Vilna Gaon that's all about the role of Mashiach ben Yosef. It's called Kol HaTov, if you remember. And over there, usually Mashiach ben Yosef is called by another name, which we discussed back then, so I'm not going to do it again. But who was the original Ben Yosef, like we read in last week's Parsha? The son of Yosef that was blessed to be the great one was Ephraim. Right? So Ephraim is usually the term used in Midrash to refer to Mashiach ben Yosef, being literally the son of Yosef. Kol HaTov points out that Ephraim, which is literal ben Yosef, the Gematria is 331, which is the Gematria of Armilus. So just like you have a connection of Gog and David, you also have the same connection of Mashiach ben Yosef, Ephraim, Armilus. They're both 331. Meaning one neutralizes the other, in the same way that Mashiach 358 neutralizes Nachash 358, you have Ephraim 331 neutralize Armilus 331. So you got the same mathematical equivalence. And if you remember that Midrash in Yalkut Shimoni, where Satan or Samael or Satan is looking and he's seeing this light and he's saying, this is the light that's going to destroy me. And who is this light, right? And specifically there it says it's Mashiach ben Yosef. It's Ephraim's light that's going to destroy the Samael quality. So I think it's important to actually distinguish the political, earthly David Gog versus the more bigger, cosmic, spiritual Mashiach ben Yosef Armilus. It's not the same. Right? And not to conflate them necessarily. One is spiritual more and one is physical more. And it could be in one person. It's not a question of two different people. Because again, one is described in more spiritual, cosmic, mystical, larger terms. And and the other is described in political, militaristic, geographical terms. Ultimately, that negative energy will be destroyed. And that's what Zechariah says as well earlier in chapter 13. He says, "V'haya bayom ha'u ne'um Hashem." God promises that on that same day, Hashem tzvaot achrit et shmot ha'atzabim, that all the names of the various idols will be destroyed. V'lo yizachru od, and they will never be remembered again. V'gam et haneviim ve'et ruach hatumah, and all the false prophets and all of that impurity and all the propaganda and all the conspiracy nonsense and all this crazy stuff and the anti-Semitism and the all these idolatries and impurities and immoralities and the debauchery and the goat demon worship, all that's going to be destroyed. Avir min haaretz, God will destroy it from the land. So hopefully we'll see that day very soon. We're almost there, God willing.
Amen.
We'll end with that. And I don't know when we're going to have the next class, because God willing. When? Part 6 of Edom? No, I think we're ready to move on. I think we've spoken about Edom enough. I don't know when it's going to be. God willing, I'm going to go to Israel this Sunday, B'ezrat Hashem. I want to just point out one last interesting thing. This Monday, which is going to be the 20th of January, and it's going to be the 20th of Tevet, it happens to be when I come to Israel. But what's just interesting is that it's also...
And it's when Trump takes a...
Right. It also is Trump's inauguration, which is going to be, I'm sure, an eventful thing. But also it's the 20th of Tevet, and I just wanted to mention that specifically because the 20th of Tevet is a very important yahrzeit. That's right. The 20th of Tevet is the yahrzeit of Rabbi Yaakov Abu Chasera, who is the namesake of this building. This synagogue is officially called the congregation, the Abir Yaakov congregation. If you go upstairs, that huge portrait, if you've seen this, right? The big portrait upstairs is a portrait of Rav Yaakov Abu Chasera, who is called the Abir Yaakov. And so it just happens to be that Trump's inauguration on Monday is also on the yahrzeit of the Abir Yaakov, who is the namesake of this building, where we're doing these classes, and in his merit in many ways, right? That all this Torah is going, and I wouldn't be going to Israel if it wasn't for the recordings from this building that got me invited to get to Israel. And so it's all connected also. It's all in the merit of the Abir Yaakov, if you really think about it. That's why this building really exists. So I want to just devote a minute to him, because the Abir Yaakov, he lived in the 19th century, 1806 to 1880. And he was this great genius and child prodigy. He seemingly knew everything by the time he was 16. And he was one of the Gedolei Morocco, one of the biggest rabbis in Morocco when he was very young. In his 30s, he was already recognized as the top person, top rabbi and sage and saint and miracle worker in Morocco. And he was the grandfather of the Baba Sali. So the Baba Sali is a little better known because it's more recent. And the Baba Sali's grandfather was the Abir Yaakov. He tried to make Aliyah towards the end of his life from Morocco. He always dreamed of living in Israel. And he tried to make Aliyah, but he only got as far as Egypt. And he passed away in Egypt.
In Goshen.
Exactly. In the north of Egypt, not too far from Alexandria, from Goshen,
right,
where Jews historically lived. And he was buried there. And there's a whole story of how they tried to exhume his body and maybe move him back to Morocco. And it never worked. And it was he was meant to be buried there. And recently, I don't know if you guys know Rav Mendel Kessin, but you heard. So Rav Mendel Kessin gave a very fascinating shiur about it and about his own personal experience of going to the tomb of the Abir Yaakov. And he connected it. You should listen to it. He connected it to World War II, because one of the turning points in World War II was that Erwin Rommel, who was this famous Nazi general, he was essentially stopped at El Alamein in Egypt, not far from where the Abir Yaakov's tomb is, and that kind of marked the turning point of the war, and things started to go downhill for the Nazis after that. And so Rav Kessin was making the case that it was in the merit of the Abir Yaakov, and that's why he needed to be buried there specifically, and why people couldn't exhume his body, because he wanted to remain there for that particular purpose. So it's a very interesting thing, and Rav Kessin also shared his own story about how he specifically went to the tomb of the Abir Yaakov at great personal risk. He flew to Egypt just for the day, just to go to that tomb in the 90s during the Oslo peace process, and to pray on behalf of Israel. Is a very touching story. But he spoke about the significance of the day of the 20th of Tevet and the connection to Trump being inaugurated on the 20th of Tevet, which is this Monday. And I think it's just really powerful, the connection to us here in this building of where this Torah is really coming from and in whose merit. And to see how God weaves together all of history, it's a pretty amazing thing. And Rav Kessin also spoke about the Mashiach ben Yosef connection here a lot more, and how he sees it connected to Mashiach ben Yosef. And for me personally, it's also a significant date because it's also my wedding anniversary. I got married on the 20th of Tevet. So who would have known that when I got married on the 20th of Tevet 12 years ago, that I didn't know that I'd be here, but that I'd be at the Abir Yaakov, and that this is where this Torah would be recorded and spread to the world, right? And I happened to get married on the Abir Yaakov's yard site. So in 2013, so it's all connected, and it's connected to the year of the snake too, because we talked a lot about the year of the snake last week, and this upcoming year is the year of the snake, 2025. We set out 2001 was the year of the snake, and 9/11 happened then, and 1989 was the year of the snake with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the beginning of the Ikot Mashiach 5750. So a bunch of people asked me, you skipped 2013. You never said what happened in 2013. You said 2001, you said 1989, you said 2025, but 2013 was the year of the snake. You never said what happened. So I'm saying what happened. I got married in 2013. That was the year of the snake too. That's my joke that I always, that was the thing that happened in 2013. But it happened to be on the 20th of Tevet. So I only want to share this story specifically to highlight the merit of the Abir Yaakov, because we are in his shul ultimately, and that's his portrait upstairs, this massive portrait on the wall, and the connection to what's happening now in Israel with Trump, January 20th, Tevet 20th, Bezrat Hashem. I'll be in Israel that same day on the 20th, and when I come back, we'll continue, God willing. Probably it'll be February 5th, so we'll pause for now until then. Okay.